Goodnight and Go. I flicked through the pages of my book. I glanced up and reached for my coffee sitting on the table in front of me. Then I saw him. Marcus from work was at the counter ordering. He looked over and tried to catch my eye. I looked down quickly at my book. I had just started working at the law firm a couple months before and was instantly attracted to Marcus. He was a younger lawyer just out of college and was lucky to get the job. I was hired on as his assistant. Well, not just his. I assisted 3 or 4 other lawyers in the firm, but I like to think of myself as Marcus's assistant. I was on break and the coffee shop was just downstairs, so it was silly of me to be surprised to see him. After Marcus paid for his coffee, he walked over to my table. "Oh, God," I mumbled. "Hi, Cindy," Marcus said. I looked up. He had a paper cup in his hand. He wasn't staying. Part of me was relieved, but another part was devastated. "Oh, hey Marcus, I didn't see you there," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. His eyebrows raised a bit at the fib. "I'll see you up there," he said, thrusting a thumb towards the ceiling. "Oh yeah, for sure." I felt my cheeks flush. Marcus smiled and nodded, then left the shop. "Smooth," I mumbled to myself, trying to read my book again. Later that day, I sat at my desk working on a proposal for one of my other attorneys. It was 5:30 p.m., and I'd almost finished up what I needed to for the day. Marcus came out of his office. He walked by my desk and tapped it lightly with his fingers. "Hey, have a good night," he smiled. "Yeah, you too." I smiled back. I always wanted to ask about any big plans he might have, if only to find out if he had a girlfriend or a boyfriend, but I could never bring myself to utter the words. He walked quickly out of the office. Would it really be so terrible if I just followed him? The moment I had the thought, I knew how absurd it was. Of course I couldn't follow him, I thought. He was cute, and he made me laugh in meetings, but I couldn't stalk him. I went back to typing up the proposal. No, I couldn't stalk my future husband. I would have to get to know him the old-fashioned, hard way. The next day, Friday, transpired much like any other day. I had prepared myself. I was finally going to ask the question that I'd been dying to ask the first time I saw Marcus. I worked like a madwoman all day so I wouldn't be distracted when he came by. As usual, Marcus left the office around 5:30 p.m. "Have a good weekend," he said. "You too. Any big plans?" I asked. Finally, I had almost lost my nerve. Why was that question so hard? Marcus paused briefly. "No, not really," he said. "That's too bad. Hey, I'm pretty much done here. Do you want to get a drink or something?" I had no idea where that had come from. I hadn't prepared that. "Oh, well, not tonight. I can't miss my train," he said. He looked genuinely disappointed. "Another time then," I said. "Sure," he said and smiled again. He breezed out of the office. Would it really be so bad? I wondered again. Before I could stop myself, I had grabbed my coat and bag and was tentatively poking my head in the hallway to make sure Marcus had already caught the elevator. He had. I ran down the hall and flew through the door marked stairs faster than I thought I could in heels and a pencil skirt. My bag banged the rail as it swung wildly from my elbow. I threw myself through the lobby door and stood behind a fake ficus tree near the elevator bay. I rummaged through my bag looking for a newspaper or magazine or something to hide my face. I finally found a months-old magazine at the bottom of my bag and managed to pull it out without spilling the rest of the bag's contents. Soon after I hid behind the magazine, one of the elevators opened, disgorging a small group. I scanned it over the top of my disguise, but I didn't see Marcus. Had I missed him? Had he been on that elevator? I hadn't seen which one he'd gotten on. I was thinking about giving up when a ding sounded, and a second car released another small crowd. Marcus was among them. He moved quickly, focused on his main goal of making his train. He glanced at his watch and picked up his pace a little. I tossed the magazine aside and began to follow him at a distance. I didn't want to fall too far behind. I had to see which line he got on. The station wasn't too far from our office, but I realized quickly that I had left my tennis shoes behind. My shoes pinched at my toes and bit at the back of my heels, but I did my best to keep up. Marcus arrived at the station and ran his work-provided pass. I didn't have one, didn't need one since I'd opted to live in the city. I watched as Marcus got further from me. Again, I was about to give up when Lady Luck decided to give me a break. An elderly woman was rummaging around in her bag when what should fall out but her transit pass. It clapped to the floor, but she didn't notice and kept rummaging. I fell in behind her and swiped it up. Sweeping by her, I ran the pass as she continued to dig around, standing just off to the side of the entrances. A little trot run, and I had caught up to Marcus. Just as we arrived on the platform, a train arrived, and Marcus got on. I got on a car behind his and eventually made my way to where he was seated, his back to me, his mop of curly dark hair swaying gently with the train's motion. I tried not to stare at him as he took out his AirPods and popped them in his ears. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket, selected some music, and began scrolling through social media, stopping to read an article here or status update there. I watched as he liked pictures, posted a comment or two, and scrolled away. Before too long, Marcus hopped off the train and I followed. He walked with a little bounce in his step, probably in time with the music he kept playing as he walked. He didn't live far. We walked for about 20 minutes and eventually came upon a little house with large front windows. I waited until his front door clicked closed, then ducked into the bushes that lined his front yard. He left his curtains standing wide open. Marcus came into view a few minutes later dressed in blue sweats and a t-shirt. He stood in the living room for a moment, his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear the words. Suddenly there was a quiet booming, and I realized he'd been asking for music. I wondered which service he used for that. There were so many these days. He danced a bit to the music that was playing before disappearing behind a wall. He reappeared with what looked like a glass full of orange juice. He disappeared a few more times as he prepared his dinner. Finally, he sat down on the sofa, turned his head, and the booming stopped. He picked up a remote and began clicking around as he ate dinner on his sofa. I couldn't see what he was watching, but I stayed rooted in place, watching Marcus go about his night. Something about this spying, this sneaking, it was wonderful. The feeling deep in my gut was like nothing I had experienced before. I stayed in place for hours, only shifting to relieve my feet or knees every now and then. I could have stayed there all night watching him, until he realized how late it was and how dark it had become. He'd been playing a video game. I had watched him switch from passively watching something as he ate dinner to pushing his plate aside and grabbing a game controller. It was the game that had distracted him from the fading light when suddenly he looked up and it was dark. He stood and grabbed the curtains. He looked into his bushes, the bushes where I was. He looked directly at me. My breath caught. I gasped quietly in my mouth, a small O of surprise, pleasant surprise. But he didn't see me, and that is what sent me over the edge. He looked right at me, but he didn't see me. I felt invincible. When I looked back, his drapes were closed. Maybe one day you'll miss your train and stay with me, I said breathlessly. Maybe I'll make you miss your train, and you won't even know it was me. I closed my eyes with a shiver. I had never acted on these weird impulses before. They always seemed so inappropriate. But this feeling, in that moment, I wished I had acted on them sooner. This was too excellent. I trekked back to the station, wondering if there were any trains running at this hour. As I walked, a plan grew in my mind. I'd change his clock in his office. It was strange, but in his office, Marcus only ever used the clock that he had brought and set himself. He never used his phone or computer to tell the time. Only the clock that hung on his wall. If I modified it while he was out, I could make him late for his train. Then he would have to stay with me, or at least get drinks with me while he waits for the next one. I felt devious and powerful, but not one bit guilty. I was only helping along, good old-fashioned getting to know you.